Most of us have grown up with a particular story about what love looks like. We've been told in songs and movies and family patterns passed down through generations that love means togetherness, that love means needing someone, that love means in some way belonging to another person. And there's something beautiful in that, the desire to merge, to be known, to be chosen. But there's also something in that story that can quietly become suffocating. And that suffocation, that slow erosion of individual selfhood within the container of a relationship, is one of the most common sources of relational pain that psychologists and therapists encounter today. So let's unpack this. Let's really dig into what freedom means in the context of intimate relationship, why we resist it, what happens when it's absent, and how we might begin to cultivate it, not as a rejection of love, but as its deepest expression. The first thing we need to understand is that human beings carry two fundamental and often competing drives. The psychologist Esther Perel has written beautifully about this. On one hand, we have the drive for security, for attachment, for closeness, for the sense that we are not alone in the world. This drive is ancient. It goes back to infancy, when our survival literally depended on our proximity to a caregiver. When that caregiver was present, we felt safe. When they disappeared, we felt terror. And while we grow up, while our bodies mature and our minds develop, that primal wiring doesn't disappear. It just gets more sophisticated. It becomes the part of us that wants a partner to text back quickly, to be home when expected, to be emotionally available, to be predictable and reliable. But alongside that drive for security, we also carry an equally powerful drive for autonomy, for self-expression, for the freedom to be a separate, sovereign individual who makes their own choices, explores their own interests, holds their own thoughts and desires, without those things being negotiated or controlled or diminished by another person. This is the part of us that wants space, that sometimes feels claustrophobic in closeness, that needs solitude, not because we don't love our partner, but because we also love and need ourselves. And here is the fundamental tension. These two drives do not naturally coexist in peace. They pull in opposite directions, and every relationship, whether consciously or not, is constantly navigating this tension. The question is not whether this tension exists. It does in every single relationship, but how you navigate it. Whether you navigate it with awareness and skill, or whether you navigate it reactively, out of fear. Because what happens when this tension is unresolved? What happens when one or both partners have not learned how to hold both their need for closeness and their need for freedom at the same time? What happens very often is control. Control is one of the most misunderstood dynamics in psychology. Most people think of control as something obviously negative. The jealous partner who checks your phone, the possessive person who monitors your friendships, the manipulative dynamic where one person uses guilt or anger or withdrawal to keep the other in line. And yes, those are forms of control, and they are damaging. But control in relationships is much more subtle than that, and it shows up in people who would never see themselves as controlling. Control shows up when someone feels anxious about their partner's independence and manages that anxiety by subtly discouraging it. It shows up when a partner becomes cold or distant whenever their significant other spends too much time on their own pursuits. It shows up in the small comments. You're always going out with friends. You don't need me anymore. Why do you need so much time alone? That slowly communicate to the other person. Your separateness is a threat to our love. And why does this happen? Almost always it comes from fear. The fear of abandonment, the fear of not being enough, the fear of losing someone. And fear, when it's unexamined, doesn't say, I'm afraid. It says, you're wrong for wanting this. It disguises itself as love. It says, I just want to be close to you, when what it really means is, your independence reminds me of every time I was left, and I can't tolerate that feeling. This is important. This is really important, because we cannot talk about freedom in relationship without talking about attachment wounds, and nearly every one of us carries them. Attachment theory, which originated with the British psychiatrist John Bowlby and was later expanded by researchers like Mary Ainsworth and Mary Main, tells us that our earliest experiences of closeness and separation shape the templates through which we experience all subsequent intimate relationships. If, as a child, our caregivers were consistently available and responsive, we developed what's called a secure attachment style, a fundamental trust that the people we love will be there for us, that we don't have to monitor the relationship constantly to keep it safe. We can be close without losing ourselves, and we can be separate without fearing loss. But many of us did not have that experience. Many of us had caregivers who were inconsistent, sometimes warm and available, sometimes cold or distracted, or emotionally absent. And from that inconsistency, we learned that love is unpredictable, that we have to work for it, that we have to stay vigilant, stay close, stay needed, or it might disappear. This is anxious attachment, and it's the attachment style most associated with difficulty tolerating a partner's freedom, because that freedom feels, at a cellular level, like the beginning of abandonment. Others had caregivers who were intrusive, who didn't respect the child's need for separateness, whose love came with conditions and enmeshment, who made the child feel that having their own inner world, their own needs, their own preferences was somehow a betrayal of the family system. And from that, we might develop avoidant attachment, where closeness itself feels threatening, where we equate intimacy with the loss of self, where we keep people at a distance, not because we don't want connection, but because some deep part of us learned that getting too close means getting swallowed. And then there's disorganized attachment, the most complex, which usually arises from experiences where the caregiver was simultaneously the source of comfort and fear, where the person who was supposed to make you feel safe was also unpredictable or frightening. This creates an internal contradiction, a wanting and a dreading of closeness at the same time, that can make adult relationships feel almost impossible to navigate. Understanding your attachment style isn't about labeling yourself or pathologizing your history. It's about recognizing that the way you respond to your partner's independence, the anxiety it may trigger, the anger, the withdrawal, the controlling impulses, is not a character flaw. It's a learned response. It made sense at some point. And it can change. Now let's talk about what freedom in relationship actually looks like, because I think there are some important misconceptions here. Freedom in relationship does not mean indifference. It does not mean emotional unavailability. It does not mean that anything goes, that there are no agreements or boundaries, that your partner's feelings don't matter. Some people confuse freedom with detachment. They use the language of independence and personal space as a way of avoiding intimacy, of not being accountable, of keeping one foot out the door at all times. That is not what we're talking about. Genuine freedom in relationship is something more specific and more demanding. It is the active, ongoing choice to honor your partner's personhood, their right to have their own inner life, their own friendships, their own interests, their own opinions, their own growth, even when that separateness is uncomfortable for you. It is the recognition that your partner is not your possession, is not an extension of yourself, is not someone whose entire existence should orbit around the relationship. They are a full human being with their own trajectory, and your love, if it is genuine, should support that trajectory, not constrain it. The philosopher Erich Fromm wrote something in his book, The Art of Loving, that has always stayed with me. He said that immature love says, "I love you because I need you." Mature love says, "I need you because I love you." That inversion is everything. Because when love is rooted in need, in the desperate need to have someone fill your emptiness, to manage your anxiety, to make you feel whole, that love will always tend toward control, because the beloved becomes a resource to be managed rather than a person to be honored. But when love comes from a place of genuine desire for another person's flourishing, when you love someone not because they complete you, but because you are genuinely delighted by who they are, then their freedom doesn't threaten you. Their growth enriches you. Their joy, even when it doesn't involve you, brings you joy. That is the aspiration, and it is difficult. It requires a level of internal security and self-sufficiency that most of us are still working toward. There's a concept in family systems therapy called differentiation, developed by the psychiatrist Murray Bowen. Differentiation refers to the capacity to maintain a clear sense of your own identity, values, and emotional functioning while remaining in close emotional contact with others. A highly differentiated person can be deeply intimate without losing themselves. They can disagree with their partner without experiencing it as a relational catastrophe. They can tolerate their partner's separateness without interpreting it as rejection. They can be present in the relationship without being fused with it. Low differentiation, on the other hand, looks like emotional fusion, where two people become so intertwined that each person's mood, choices, and sense of self is constantly being shaped and regulated by the other. Where one person's anxiety automatically becomes the other person's anxiety. Where disagreement feels like abandonment and independence feels like betrayal. The paradox that Bowen identified, and this is one of the most important insights in relational psychology, is that the more differentiated you are, the more capable of genuine intimacy you become. It seems counterintuitive. We might think that closeness comes from merging, from having no boundaries, from prioritizing the relationship above all else. But fusion is not intimacy. Fusion is two people using each other to regulate their anxiety. And that is a very different thing from two individuals who choose, every day, to be in relationship with each other, who remain distinct enough to actually see each other, to find each other interesting, to be attracted to someone who is genuinely other, genuinely surprising. Desire, in fact, requires otherness. This is one of the central insights of Esther Perel's work. The erotic, the life force within a relationship, thrives on distance as much as on closeness, on mystery as much as on familiarity. When we lose all sense of separateness, when we become completely predictable to each other, when we know every detail of each other's inner world and there is no private space left, something essential tends to die. Not love, perhaps, but aliveness. The spark that comes from encountering someone who is genuinely other than you. This brings us to a question that I find genuinely fascinating. Why do so many people fear their partner's freedom? Why is it so common for people to feel threatened by their partner having deep friendships, individual passions, professional success, or simply time alone? Part of the answer, as we've discussed, is attachment anxiety, the fear that if my partner has too much that doesn't involve me, they will eventually decide they don't need me and leave. But there's another psychological dynamic at play, which is something that the psychoanalytic tradition calls projective identification, and in everyday terms we might call it the loss of the mirror. When we are in relationship, especially in close, long-term relationship, we often develop a subtle but powerful need for our partner to reflect back to us a particular version of ourselves. If I see myself as someone's primary source of support, their most important person, their emotional center, then I need my partner to act in ways that confirm this story. If they start to develop other deep connections, if they become more self-sufficient, if they need me less, this doesn't just feel threatening to the relationship, it threatens my identity, my sense of who I am. This is why some people unconsciously, and sometimes consciously, keep their partners small, keep them dependent, undermine their confidence, discourage their friendships. Because a smaller, more dependent partner is a safer mirror. They are less likely to outgrow you, less likely to discover that they don't need you in the way you need to be needed. And this is dark. I want to name that this is dark, but it is real, and it operates in ways that the people doing it are often not aware of. No one wakes up and says, "Today I will undermine my partner's confidence to keep them dependent on me." It happens through patterns of behavior that feel, from the inside, like love, like concern, like protectiveness, when actually they are forms of control rooted in fear and insecurity. So how do we move towards something healthier? How do we begin to cultivate the kind of love that can hold both deep intimacy and genuine freedom? The first and most essential step is developing what we might call internal security, the capacity to self-soothe, to tolerate uncomfortable emotions, to be with yourself in a way that doesn't require constant external validation. This is, at its core, the work of healing your attachment wounds. And it is work. It involves becoming curious about your reactivity. When you feel threatened by your partner's independence, rather than acting on that threat, rather than expressing anger or withdrawal or passive-aggressive commentary, you learn to get curious about it. What is this fear? Where does it live in my body? When have I felt this before? What is the story I'm telling myself about what their freedom means for our future? This is not comfortable work. Sitting with fear rather than acting on it is genuinely difficult, but it is the only way to break the cycle. The second step is communication, but not just any communication. the kind of communication where we speak from vulnerability rather than from control. Instead of, "You always prioritize your friends over me," which is a communication of blame that will predictably trigger defensiveness, we practice saying, "When you're away, I sometimes feel lonely and anxious, and I'd love to talk about how we stay connected even when we have separate lives." That is the same underlying experience communicated in a way that invites intimacy rather than igniting conflict. This is the work of what the psychologist Sue Johnson, who developed emotionally focused therapy, calls reaching for your partner with your fear rather than your anger. Because fear is the soft underbelly of most relational anger. Beneath, "Why didn't you text me back?" is almost always, "I was afraid you didn't care about me." And the person who hears the fear can respond with compassion. The person who receives only the anger will respond with defense or withdrawal. And the cycle continues. The third step is cultivating what we might call a secure base for each other's exploration. In the original attachment theory literature, the secure base concept referred to the way a child uses their caregiver as a base from which to explore the world, going out, taking risks, coming back, being refueled, going out again. The research of psychologists like Brooke Feeney and Nancy Collins has shown that this same dynamic operates in adult romantic relationships. The most thriving couples are those where each partner genuinely supports the other's individual exploration, their goals, their passions, their friendships, their growth, while also providing a reliable, emotionally available home base to return to. This is not a small thing to offer someone, to say, genuinely, "Go, explore, grow, have your own life, and know that I will be here when you return," not with resentment or jealousy or a list of grievances, but with genuine interest in who you are becoming. That kind of love, that kind of spacious, generous, secure love, is both rare and profoundly sustaining. I want to spend the last few minutes on something that I think doesn't get enough attention in conversations about freedom and relationship, and that is the freedom to be authentic, to be genuinely unedited yourself with your partner. One of the great losses in many long-term relationships is the slow disappearance of authenticity. The gradual process of self-editing that happens when we learn, over time, which parts of ourselves our partner approves of and which parts they find difficult. When we learn that expressing certain needs leads to conflict, that showing certain emotions is unwelcome, that holding certain opinions creates distance, we start to perform rather than simply be. And this is a profound form of unfreedom. The loss of the freedom to simply be yourself in the presence of someone who claims to love you. Genuine intimacy, what the psychologist David Schnarch calls differentiated intimacy, requires two people who are secure enough in themselves and trusting enough in each other to be fully present, to bring their actual selves into the room, not the managed, curated versions, to risk being seen, disagreed with, challenging, imperfect, difficult, and to trust that the love between them is large enough to hold all of that. This is, ultimately, what we are all seeking in relationship. Not a perfect mirror, not a guarantee of safety, not a perfectly controlled environment where no uncomfortable feelings arise. What we are seeking, at the deepest level, is the experience of being fully known, including in our complexity, our contradictions, our needs, our wounds, and being loved anyway, not despite all of it, because of all of it. And here is what I want to leave you with. That quality of love, that free, spacious, genuinely accepting love, cannot be demanded or controlled into existence. It can only emerge when two people have done enough of their own work to not need the relationship to be something other than what it is, when they are secure enough to allow each other to be free, when they trust enough to be authentic, when they love enough to wish for each other's fullness, even when that fullness extends beyond what they share together. That is the psychology of freedom in relationship. It is not a destination. It is a practice, sometimes uncomfortable, always worthwhile, and at its best, one of the most profound forms of love human beings are capable of offering each other. Thank you.